This is the Enragé, a show where we take a deeper dive into written works published at the Center for a Stateless Society. Join us as we give voice to the ideas challenging the vain phantoms that haunt our social reality and stand in the way of total liberation. For more information, visit c4ss.org. And to support this show or any of the other projects happening at the Center, please visit patreon.com/c4ss.org. Thank you for listening. Hello, and thank you for tuning in to the 12th episode of The Enragé. I'm your host, Joel Williamson, and today we'll be joined by Shane Ross to discuss their first article published at the Center titled Malicious Faux Individualism and Market Anti-Capitalism. Shane is a Taoist, anarchist, and mutualist writer based in the Twin Cities. Shane, welcome to the show.
Hi, thank you for having me.
Yeah, absolutely. How's it going? How are you today?
I'm good. Just made a lot of Christmas cookies, which is always fun. How are you doing?
I'm doing well. Christmas cookies sound nice.
Yeah.
Cool. So I noticed you have a link to your blog on your Twitter. When did you start writing, and what made you interested in political science?
Yeah, so I've grown up around politics a lot. My parents talked about it, and teachers at school, I remember, would have us have class discussions. But I think I really got into academic politics, or I guess just the more heavier side of politics around 2019. I think I started studying with things like feminism and capitalism, and I think over time I just I picked up Marx, I remember, and Bakunin, and then I just kept reading, and I arrived at whatever I am intellectually today. So
cool. Do you have a particular box that you fit in? Well, other than mutualist, I guess.
Yeah, I guess that's probably the main one. I tend to align with a lot of people at the Center overall, but yeah, I think mutualist pretty much encompasses it.
Cool. And so how did you hear the Center for a Stateless Society?
Back in 2020, I was on Twitter, and I still identified as an ANCOM at the time, typical Kropotkin reading ANCOM. And the Center followed me on Twitter, and I had never heard of it. I barely knew that mutualism existed. So that was how I found out, and I ended up clicking on the Center's website from after they followed me and reading a bit, and I asked some other people I knew on Twitter that were affiliated with left-wing market anarchism. And over time, I just grew more and more interested in it, and over the past year, I've just really become invested in the thought. Yeah.
Very cool. That's pretty interesting. I guess most radical changes and convictions usually doesn't start with a Twitter follow.
Yeah, it was an interesting story, but...
Yeah, that's cool. So why'd you decide to write this piece as your first C4SS article?
So I think at first, when I was an ANCOM, turned me off of market libertarianism in general was that I associated it with the status quo, basically, because I associated our current society, the status quo, with things like markets and individualism. And I think a lot of people on the left do that. They associate capitalism and just our current status quo, our current state of being, with things like markets and individualism and libertarianism. And inadvertently, a lot of libertarians ended up defending the status quo. And I think that both of those are kind of flawed stances, because I don't think there's a whole lot in common with the concepts of markets and individual liberty and the status quo and how it is today. So I think I just wrote it to try to clear that up and say there is nothing that is tying the status quo and capitalism together with things like markets and individualism on a broad scale.
Yeah, totally. So getting into the piece a little bit, you point out at the beginning of the article that our analysis of capitalism should evolve as capitalism does. What are some examples of analysis of capitalism that fail to describe it in its current iteration?
I think first, there's definitely a modern quote-unquote anti-capitalism, I guess, that is kind of in line with Bernie Sanders almost and the Democratic Socialist political parties. And I think the flaw there is that a lot of the time, the issues with capitalism are not actually escaped by ideas like social democracy. So people will call themselves anti-capitalists, but just sort of inadvertently support capitalism in the end. And then also, I think a part of the flawed issue, even on the far left, of how we analyze capitalism is that we get it from like the classical Marxist authors of the 19th century, which of course they were influential in developing anti-capitalism. But in my readings of like Marx and Lenin and Engels and stuff, like I think a couple flaws is one, they tend to associate capitalism. They ignore anything it has to do with the state. Like they'll Marx agreed that the state helped form capitalism, but beyond that, he just describes capitalism as free markets a lot, which is, I think, very inaccurate. And I think that is kind of a misrepresentation of actual anti-capitalist thought. And I think a part of it too is that like anti-capitalists tend to focus specifically on like class politics, and so that's where the dictatorship of the proletariat comes in, where I think that if we zoom out a little bit more, we'll notice broader issues with capitalism like authority. So I think that's part of why our current analysis of capitalism tends to be lacking in some ways.
Right. What has been the result of analysis that fails to truly understand the root of actually existing capitalism?
Yeah, so I think just the ignorance around authority and how it plays into capitalism kind of leads into the issue that I was talking about when I wrote this article of like people equating things like markets and individualism with the status quo. Because if we're not recognizing how fundamental the state is in maintaining the status quo and in maintaining capitalism, then we're kind of misidentifying our target as just markets, when in reality the issue with our economy is not that they're run by markets. The issue a lot of the time is just that it's run centripetally and it's run with a lot of hierarchy and bureaucracy, and there's not sort of free exchange as there should be. But I think by misunderstanding capitalism and how it came to be and how it functions, we misidentify the target, I guess, of anti-capitalist movements. And that can be harmful because we're recreating some harmful things and we're attacking the wrong aspects of our current economic order, if that makes sense.
Yeah, that definitely makes sense. So when trying to articulate an accurate, updated understanding of capitalism, you suggest unpacking the concept of legitimate ownership. What is legitimate ownership beyond the state?
Yeah, so I've seen people like communists and other anarchists and stuff that will say that like we want to abolish ownership, right? That the goal is to abolish ownership because ownership is tied to capital. But a lot of communists at the same time will say that like we distinguish between private and personal property. And I think that's important to say that like people have personal possessions. They had personal possessions before the state came to exist, and they will have personal possessions after the state doesn't exist or continues to exist. That's just like a key part of human relationships as far as economics go. And I think that trying to remove any definition of ownership sort of ignores that very fundamental piece of human exchange. And instead, we can see that the distinction between private property and personal property or possessions is really purely maintained by the state, right? So like beyond a state figure, because there is no specific laws or organizations maintaining constructs like intellectual or absentee property, we don't have the same massive private property issues and like massive landlord deals and whatever that we have right now, these monopolies that are constructed. Like as Benjamin Tucker talked about, the intellectual property monopoly, like these are maintained by the state, and ownership can exist beyond the state, but these specific negative forms of ownership are maintained by the state. So
Right. So you emphasize the importance of individual ownership over even non-statist collective ownership as a means to resolve property disputes.
yeah.
Do you see this as compatible with calls by left libertarians like Roderick Long and Kevin Carson for commons in the style of Elinor Ostrom?
I think that part of the concept of individual ownership in libertarian circles should revolve around like free possession and free exchange. So I don't think that a concept of the commons is necessarily contradictory with that, but I do think that there are some issues with some ways that commons are conceptualized. I'll say though that like a way that commons I think could exist and could be useful is that if we treat ownership as use or as possession, I think that, you know, what is unowned, what is unpossessed kind of functions as a commons that people can actively utilize. So like, I guess like if we live in a forest and, you know, my house is my house, your house is your house, but maybe the trees could be considered our commons in a sense, right? Because nobody's using them. So I think that that's definitely a thing. Logan at the Center wrote a article about library models too, and I think that's also a really interesting way like a sharing economy could exist in a liberatory form, like set upon barter agreements or like super small fees that you pay to like a library and you get a vast amount of tools to rent from. And like I think that there can be certain common things, but I think that the advantage that typically markets have over like traditional anarcho-communist common things like that is that markets have a very like centrifugal tendency naturally, and they sort of maximize distribution and exchange in line with human desire, whereas communism sort of, at least in some sense, relies on altruistic actors and it doesn't have the same centrifugal nature. I'm not like against commons, but I think that I'd say that markets just have a lot of potential, and so I'm just like explicitly pro market in that sense.
Cool. Okay, so one more question on the topic of legitimate ownership. In the article, you make a provocative claim that, quote, true and infinite privatization means no more rent. A lot of folks associate residential private property with landlordism. What does, quote, true privatization mean, and why would it mean the abolition of rent?
So I think that we need to recognize that like the means in which rent currently exists rely on the state, right? So a lot of libertarians would typically contrast between the private and public sector, but a lot of the existing private sector, I don't remember who wrote it, but there's an article about this at the Center. A lot of the existing private sector is actually upheld entirely by state action. It's not separable from state authority or what some would call the public sector. So if we were to truly privatize in a sense, and that just means like treat ownership as purely individual, purely possessive, these massive hierarchical structures that maintain constructs that rely on state force like rent, as I explained in the article, they would sort of dissolve almost. And Pruden talked about that too, how like by allowing free and absentee-free ownership, we sort of dissolve rent and these bureaucratic organizations over time, because this individualized ownership model does no longer rely on this massive state violence. And because of that, things like rent and things like taxes that rely on state violence just sort of go away over time.
Cool. You described markets beautifully as the many moments of reciprocal exchange, and how the implications of freed markets would necessarily lead to a variety of freedoms, including the abolition of the wage system. What you described is pretty uncontroversial in left-wing market anarchist spaces, as is your emphasis on the state's role in maintaining the economic status quo. In your opinion, what are some of the more less obvious or underemphasized ways in which the state maintains capitalist markets?
I think a lot of it has to do with like how the state inadvertently, by the state maintaining monopoly and things like that, and restricting economic exchange to the point where everything has to be logged, taxed, regulations, everything. Because we're limiting free exchange like this, your only option really is to work for someone. And because of that, we have all this like shit competition, all these like bad jobs that don't really benefit anyone. As I think David Graeber called them BS jobs. I think that the state has a huge role in maintaining jobs that just like are not genuinely benefiting anyone, and like that capitalism relies on, but that humans don't, you know? I also think that like the reason, pay is so bad is because capitalism and the state and authority in general maintain these sort of like unequal negotiations between employees and employers. So that's also a thing. And ideally, it was talked about in Markets Not Capitalism too, how like in previous times before authority came in, workers' unions were able to provide like health insurance and such like that for their workers. So I think that without the state and without all these capitalist bureaucracies in the economy, that a lot of aspects of like bad jobs and bad pay and lack of insurance could be solved, along with things like rent and monopoly. Foucault talked about too how the state's monopoly on credit and like fiat currency shifts the way that money is used, and I think that money in general would look very differently without a state as well. So I think that's important.
Cool. Yeah, I definitely want to ask you something about money in a couple questions from now. Before we get into that, You also mentioned that mutualist markets would result in a fundamentally different relationship to work as we know it within capitalism.
Yeah.
Can you explain how freed markets complement the post-left emphasis on work abolition?
Yeah, so I've never spoken to someone who would call themselves a post-left anarchist who would say that work abolition just means the abolition of labor, right? The key piece of work abolition, as Bob Black talked about it, was that work is something you despise. It's defined by your lack of wanting to do it. But if we had a freed market without all this BS competition and with freed economic exchange where you're not forced to work for an employer, I think that the only labor that's really being inputted is either that's absolutely necessary or that people want to do, that people desire to do. So by liberating labor as a concept from our current shackles of economic control, I think that people will be free to exchange labor in a way that they want to, that is personal to them. And in that sense, it doesn't feel like work because it's not some monotonous 9 to 5 you're going to every day, right? It's just labor that you're doing because you want to do it, and you can mutually benefit with people and aid people through the doing of that labor without it being some awful work construct, if that makes sense.
Yeah, that definitely makes sense. I think what you just said answered this next question, but I'm going to ask it to you anyways, and just sort of give you my thoughts on the matter, and you tell me what's right and what's wrong with my reasoning here.
Yeah, for sure.
It seems to me that work as we know it correlates directly with artificial scarcity, and that abolishing the state would free labor to the extent that it perpetuates those scarcities. It seems to me then that while stateless markets would likely minimize work, they wouldn't necessarily abolish them, because at the end of the day, we still do live in a world with many resources that are naturally scarce. And that requires labor to have those resources effectively allocated.
Yeah.
So while personally I love the idea of work abolition, I feel that there may be limits to this goal as long as we have to deal with natural scarcity, basically. So,
yeah.
I mean, is there anything wrong with my line of reasoning there? And what am I missing?
So I think it really depends on how we define work, right? But if we're defining work in the sense that, like, work is what you despise to do, work is not what you want to do, I think that there are people that would genuinely enjoy dealing with natural scarcity. You know, if the natural scarcity is housing, for example, there are people who enjoy architecture, and there are people that enjoy growing food, and there are people that enjoy cooking food. I think that, like, truly, without all this, like, faux monopoly that we have going on, I think an economy could, even within scarcity, be run almost entirely on desire. And I think that's part of the realization of market anarchists, that work doesn't have to be this shitty, you know? Like, we can, I think most market anarchists can be like, we can make market economies significantly better than how they look right now.
Yeah.
I think William Gillis from the center calls himself anti-work as well. So I don't think there's necessarily like cutoff between market anarchists and anti-work. I think they have some overlap that is definitely workable, and I think it kind of fits into how we would view stateless labor as opposed to capitalist labor. Yeah,
cool. Getting to an overarching theme in the article about individualism, why is individualism, as you see it, at odds with the quote American dream?
So I think the American dream is kind of like an advertisement campaign, right? It was constructed mainly in the 40s and 50s, post-World War II, to like create suburbia, and, you know, it's selling this idea that like you can do whatever you want. And even now it's sort of like this, like, oh, like you can come here and you can work and you can create a new life for yourself. But I think a lot of the American dream idea rests upon like borders and bad work and the idea that you have to like labor really hard to earn things. And I think like a true freed individualism would free itself from this sort of nationalist thing. And instead of selling an American dream that says you can theoretically succeed even when it's very difficult because of existing monopoly, I think that like a true individualist economic system would guarantee free competition and would guarantee free exchange and success, instead of emphasizing that there's some sort of potential somewhere and that you have to labor hard and do things you don't want to do and cut through borders and stuff like that.
Yeah, hell yeah. So you wrote that the logical strategic conclusion of anti-capitalist individualism might be found in agorism.
Mhm.
So to what extent do you think we should put our efforts into Konkin's vision of an agorist revolution?
So honestly, I think that with the left Rothbardians like Konkin and with mutualists, I kind of wish there was a bigger crossover because I think that they're definitely natural allies. I just think that like the whole point of agorism, in a sense, is to build alternative market networks, to build networks of exchange that are mutually beneficial and reciprocal that don't rely on the state. And that's really the goal of any anarchist almost, to build exchange networks that don't rely on the state and that are reciprocal. So I think that agorism is so strong as an economic tactic because it's like one actively resisting state monopoly on exchange, but it's also benefiting the people that are participating in it. So I think that agorism has a lot of potential and it's currently sort of untapped, but I think that we're starting to see ideas like Web3 or whatever spawn out of this sort of agorist center of the internet. And I think that it's really exciting because I think there is a genuine possibility for liberatory markets and liberatory exchange to come out of things like counter economies and stuff like that.
Beyond counter economics and agorism, what are some other strategies that you feel are compatible with anti-capitalist individualism?
I definitely think that mutual aid is always like key anarchist or whatever. I kind of get sad when I see some right libertarians like saying that mutual aid is bad because like I don't really think anyone that hopes to be a libertarian can be like, free reciprocal exchange is bad, whatever. But like, I think really we can view mutual exchange or mutual aid, whether it's monetary or non-monetary, as just like a good force, a force for good in general. And of course, like community education, protesting to an extent, like I think that they're just being very vocal and educational about the issues that the state poses and constructing better local and interregional networks to deal with those things, whether it's with agorism or whether it's completely outside of that realm of counter economics. I just think that it's really important to build support networks that lie beyond authority. Kind of what Proudhon would call dual power, right? You're like building a new economy out of the shell of the old, as Carson would put it.
Sure. So getting back to cryptocurrency a little bit, and while we're on the topic of tactics, in the article you mentioned that crypto itself can fuel anti-capitalist individualist goals.
Yeah.
What's the overlap there?
So crypto itself, I think, and in a very broad sense, it provides an opportunity for theoretically unmediated exchange. So it's providing an opportunity for exchange to lie beyond the state, and it's doing so in a way that doesn't rely on constructs like fiat currency or tax systems, which I think is really important. And we can also see real world examples of how crypto has been used in this sort of like emancipatory format. So I know that there are like markets that, trans people in countries without access to things can buy like certain things with Bitcoin that they can't with real money in their own countries. So, getting hormones to people who want them. Or, for example, in Nigeria, I know there was a massive protest led by a Nigerian feminist movement. And because the government was trying to shut down their exchange and their control, they switched over to Bitcoin, and that ended up empowering them to protest. So we can see places in the world where, even though crypto has its downsides, where crypto has been really genuinely good for the liberation movement, and where we can see how we can keep using it in an emancipatory format, I'd say.
You talk about cryptocurrency as a means to make money, quote, less of a driver of power and more simply a means of economic calculation/exchange. How would you respond to its usage as a speculative investment tool nowadays?
I think that it's kind of sad almost that like something with so much potential has been like kind of shut down with like Elon Musk fans. But I think that there is definitely an area of potential in crypto. Like, I feel like we need to separate the people who are using crypto as like basically a second stock market that relies on Elon Musk's tweets basically, versus people who use crypto as like a genuinely good thing, a genuinely positive thing overall. So I think that even while there are downsides to crypto, it still has potential to be really good. And I hope that we can see it be used in more of those ways and less as a weird tech bro, like niche interest way almost.
So when you think about stateless money in general, what comes to mind for you personally? Is it mostly cryptocurrency, or are you envisioning some sort of mixture between that and precious metals? In your imagined utopia, what is it that money actually looks like?
Yeah, so I think one thing that's really important to recognize is that like the function of money looks different outside of a state, but I think the actual physical existence of money, it would be a mix of like local things to barter with. I think there would be a lot of cryptocurrency just to make things easier to transact, like easier in transaction type stuff. I think that there is definitely room for a lot of different forms of money, and I think that there is a incentive without a state for money to be in all these different forms and to exist in lots of different ways. I don't really know how to put it, but like I think that money will become multiplicitous and just like exist in a more liberated and fluxed format than like this like static fiat currency that sort of controls what you can do with it. I think what's also important to talk about is how like money itself would look without a state, right? So right now, a lot of people would criticize money for being like, oh, it accumulates, it assures greed, like whatever. But I think that we can turn to both theoretical constructs of money and actual constructs of money to point out how that isn't necessarily true. For example, there's a article on indigenous markets or like markets in indigenous Mexico that I read a while back that talked about how the currency they use called monedas, they did not accumulate, they purely circulated. And the key difference between that money and capitalist money is one, for that exchange to be valid, they would have little trade slips that needed to be mutually stamped by partners, equal partners. So every single trade was reciprocal. And as a result, value was sort of accurately represented in trade. And because also there was no force that was protecting all these monopolies and states, these vast markets would happen pretty often. And somehow nobody accumulated vast amounts of wealth and everybody was getting fed, right? So I think money, in a sense, definitely can function in a different way than it does now. And I think that people sort of associate the entire concept of currency with fiat currency, which I think is a fundamentally flawed way of looking at it, in the sense that money can exist in many different forms and do many things beyond accumulate, you know? I think that's important.
Yeah, for sure. So throughout the article, you have sprinkled like continental implications.
Yeah.
And in your Twitter bio, you call yourself a Deluso Hayekian.
Yeah.
So to what extent have continental philosophers or postmodern philosophy, to what extent has that sort of influenced your perspective when it came to understanding these topics?
They've actually played a really big role in my understanding of things. I'm writing a really big thing right now. I'll probably release it on the center in a couple parts, just like explaining the compatibility between postmodern politics, post-structuralist politics, and ideas like mutualism. Because first, I think that a lot of postmodern ideas and postmodern critiques, specifically of Marxism, fall in line with our ideas, right? So like Foucault, I think, criticized Marx partially because it was too focused in, centered on structuralized class relations that weren't necessarily the bottom line of economic control. And that's kind of what we'd say, right? That economic control and capitalism have effects beyond purely the monopolization of the means of production. There is another aspect there, and that is just hierarchy in general and control. And I'd also say that a lot of my emphasis on like desire and free desire within labor comes from like Deleuzean literature. I know that in my readings of Poverty of Philosophy by Marx, a lot of Marx's critiques of Proudhon were centered around the fact that he was failing at Hegelian dialectics. And because the postmodernists basically escaped Hegelian dialectics, they were anti-dialectics, it frees a lot of our thoughts surrounding things like class and synthesis. So I think that there's a huge untapped crossover between ideas present in post-structuralism and ideas present in market anarchism that I sort of wish were explored more. So I think I will write things about those going forward. But yeah, I think there is definitely a crossover, and I've definitely been influenced by people like Deleuze, Guattari, Foucault, Nietzsche. He's not a post-structuralist, but like continental philosophers in the crafting of my specific flavor of anarchy, I guess.
Yeah, sure. And you also identify as a Taoist. I was actually into Taoism myself for a while there, and still am to some extent.
Yeah.
But I was curious how you square the sort of minimalist emphasis in Taoism with the complexity that's often associated with markets. Like, do you see any tension between like the minimalism within Taoism and the embracing of complexity in a lot of market economics?
Yeah, so I think the question you're asking is basically getting on like Taoism is around simplicity, and like a lot of market economics surround like complexity, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like that's a sort of gap that I have to bridge. But honestly, I think that those ideas are actually really compatible if you think about it. Because would you say, for example, that like nature is complicated, right? Like how nature works, how ecosystems work?
I mean, it depends on your perspective. In one sense it is, and in another sense it's not. I mean, it's deeply complicated, like rhizomes, are like extremely fascinating, for example. But in another sense, it's like, the appreciation of a tree is a lot more simple than, say, spontaneous order discovering subjective value within a market system or something.
Yes. So I think that the comparison is that like both ecosystems and market systems, they rely at their very fundamental level on these very simple exchanges. So like sure, like subjective value and like exchange, but if we were to define markets like I did in the article as many moments of reciprocal exchange, these moments of reciprocal exchange are these like tiny little simple exchanges almost. Like if I'm buying something, it's not some super complex thing, but if you zoom out, it's a super complex interlocking web. And I think that's the crossover. So I think, or like at least my interpretation of Lao Tzu was he's saying that simplicity and complexity tie together, and that the complexity, this like impersonal complexity of the Tao, of nature, or of markets really, is driven by the simplicity that is present in reciprocal exchanges, individual reciprocal exchanges, or in like a deer eating a plant, right? So like these tiny individual moments of simplicity tie into this vast network of complexity. And I actually see a lot of similarities there between Taoist contemplations on ecology and between economic contemplations around market systems.
That's really beautiful. Thanks for that response.
Yeah.
So what are your plans moving forward? What's your next article? What do you think you will plan to tackle next at the center?
Ooh, okay. So I did a short little reading and review of Marx's Poverty of Philosophy. I don't know if it's going to get published at the center. If it doesn't, I'll just like put it on my little blog page. But I talked to Corey about writing an article talking about, how like Tucker had his thing about like unterrified Jeffersonianism?
Yes.
I was going to talk about unterrified Hayekianism. So I was going to talk about how if you really take Hayek's knowledge problem to its natural conclusion, you can attack bureaucracy within capitalist firms as well. So I was going to talk about that. That's an article that might be coming out at some point. Corey is sent me some articles to work on with that. But yeah, I'm definitely excited to like working with the center going forward. I've been talking to some people at the center about articles to write, and I think moving forward there'll be both an emphasis on like Hayek, and I'll also be talking about how ideas about like post-structuralism and Taoism can tie into markets in general. So yeah.
Badass. I'm really looking forward to that. That sounds really cool.
It'll be fun.
Yeah. So what are some essential resources that folks should take advantage of if they want to learn more about all that we've discussed today?
Yeah, so obviously the center is a huge resource. There's a lot of books in the center that do a really good job explaining. There's a lot of articles that do a good job explaining like how markets and capitalism differ. There's tons of essays by the likes of Kevin Carson and William Gillis that just go into the complexities of market systems that I think are really interesting to look at. if you're looking for more like broad philosophical things, like we kind of talked about with like Taoism and post-structuralism, there's a couple good YouTube videos out there, like Deleuze's Nietzsche and Philosophy is a good book. I think everybody should read Lao Tzu's Tao Te Ching. It's just like a quick 80-page poetry book. It's really beautiful. The philosophy's been around 4,000 years. I think that that's a really fun read for pretty much anyone. But yeah, I think there's a lot of available resources covering a wide range of topics that you can learn from surrounding today's discussion.
Awesome. Well, where can folks go to follow you and your work?
My Twitter is at Daocuck. I have my blog on there. I talk about a couple things. I like publish some like drafts surrounding like ethics and markets and post-structuralism on my blog. So I have some articles on there. And I just in general, like I think I'll have more work with the center coming out relatively soon. So just watch out for that, I guess.
Awesome. Well, I really appreciate you joining me today, Shane.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me.
Yeah, and thank you for writing your article, and I'm sure everyone looks forward to reading and hearing more from you.
Yep. All right, thank you.
Yeah, absolutely. You have a good day. Talk to you soon.
You too.